everybody. Welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And today we're going to be looking at the life and work of Booker T. Washington. And Booker T. Washington is the founding principal and first president of the Tuskegee Normal School and Industrial Institute in Tuskegee, Alabama. Which is now Tuskegee University. And if you, I was looking at their website earlier, it's a major university. So you have this man in Booker T. Washington, Booker Taliaferro Washington. We'll talk about that in a minute. Who is born in slavery and rises all the way up to visiting the White House and founding a university or starting a university. Chris, this is a man, though at times controversial, who has a great resume.
Yeah, it's really a great movie that I'm surprised has not been made because it is unimaginable that from his beginnings he makes it to where he ends up in life. And when we think about Booker T. Washington, excuse me, several people who have gone before us have had some remarkable things to say about this individual who basically out of nothing became something. The novelist William Dean Howells called him in 1901. He said he is a public man who is second to no other American in importance. Theodore Roosevelt, who invited him to come and dine at the White House, called Washington one of the most useful citizens of our land. Even someone that he disagreed with, a critic of his, who was W.E.B. Du Bois, he acknowledged Washington's status and referred to him as a recognized spokesman of his 10 million fellows and one of the most notable figures in a nation of 70 million. So when you really see this, here is an excuse me, here is an individual who spoke out loudly about equality and truly sought to make a difference in the lives of all Black Americans.
Yeah, and like we said earlier, you mentioned Teddy Roosevelt, that Teddy Roosevelt invited him to the White House, and that was a brave move on the part of Roosevelt because this is the first time in the history of the United States that a Black man had been invited by the President of the United States to dine in the White House. Of course, unfortunately, Black people had been in the White House as slaves. They were involved in the construction of the White House as slaves. But here in 1901, young Booker T. Washington is invited to the White House to sit down with the President of the United States and advise the President of the United States. And Roosevelt's successor, William Howard Taft, one of my favorite presidents, he actually had Washington as an advisor, so to speak, as well. So this is a man who goes from slavery. He's born to his mom's a slave woman. He doesn't, I don't think he really knows who his father is. His mother initially names him Booker Taliaferro. And Chris, the name Taliaferro is sort of when I read that first, I was like, oh, that's interesting because my fourth grade teacher, one of my favorite teachers in all of my K through 12 education, was Miss Taliaferro. So I recognized the name. When he came to school, when he was freed from slavery in 1865, and they moved to West Virginia, and he enrolled in school, and he enrolled himself from school, he put the name Washington on the as his surname or his last name, in honor, I guess you could say, of Washington Ferguson, who was his mom's new husband. So this is a guy who, he enrolls himself in school, he changes his name. This is a guy who even early on, he's going to show a determined streak.
And it's that determination that, while he is in school and, as you mentioned, he comes, as the book says, up from slavery. He has the opportunity to enroll in a school where he has the acquisition of literacy and he has an exposure to things that other individuals did not have. And, during those early years, it allowed him an opportunity to envision a better life for himself, but also not just for himself, but it gave him the opportunity to devote a career, what he would say would be a calling that he would later go on to describe in that autobiography. the lifting up of his people. And so he really begins in earnest, recognizing that to do this, I'm going to have to go and make a difference. And so, he was in West Virginia for a time. And so to make that happen, he recognizes he needs to go back home. And that's where, he will go back home to actually Hampton, Virginia. And we heard of the Hampton Institute. And,
Mhm.
many people do not know about the Hampton Institute. I'm from that area. I grew up in Chesapeake, Virginia, which is about 30 minutes from Hampton, Virginia. And honestly, I was not aware of the Hampton Institute, but founded in 1868, that place was an opportunity where formerly enslaved people and their children had greater opportunities to be able to make a difference, especially in what's known as industrial education. And
Mhm.
that's where Booker T really makes his name in the technical areas, what we would see as CTE, career technical education today, things such as bricklaying and carpentry and sewing, and also teacher training. And so, Washington has the opportunity to go there. And honestly, that's where he begins his big break, if you will.
Yeah, and one thing you didn't mention there, Chris, and people our age, I don't know about younger generations, but people our age and maybe a little older, we've heard the stories from our parents and grandparents about how they had to walk to school in the snow, the blowing gale force wind up the hill, all that. Booker Washington, young Booker T. Washington walked, Chris, 500 miles to this school. I mean, we've got kids today that they can barely get on the school bus to get to school. And now you have this young man who is walking 500 miles to get to a school. I don't know many students today, Chris, who I'm sure there are a few, but I don't know if there's a lot. And there probably weren't a lot in his time either who would take it upon themselves to walk 500 miles to go to school.
And to go to a school that he had not been accepted to. I
Right.
mean, that's the other thing. He's walking to a school hoping and praying for an opportunity, and when he gets there, they say, "Well, if we're even going to consider you, you're going to have to take an exam." And right, that exam was that he had to sweep and dust a room, and he had to demonstrate his ability to get dirty, if you will, and to really, not uh, say that he was better than anybody else. And he passed that exam quite well, and that helps him become disciplined. And so he will graduate from the Hampton Institute, and then he'll go and he'll go teach in another place. And then he returns to Hampton Institute, where he has the opportunity to teach there and to work there. And it's at that opportunity, it's at that place where he has the opportunity to pursue something greater. And that's where we come into what you talked about earlier, because in that moment, he is recommended to go and to lead a new school for African Americans that would be found in Alabama, that was known as Tuskegee. And Washington will be the first teacher as well as the first leader of that school. And I think, he will start out with 30 students. And right by the time that his tenure is done at Tuskegee, what an amazing school he has built, as you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, and when he got there, Chris, and he got the invitation to go down there to Alabama and help start this school, and I don't know what he thought he was getting into, but when he goes down there, there's nothing. I mean, there's not a school. There's ground. I mean, that's really all there is. So he really has to start from the bottom with this school. He has to work to build the school. And in fact, he got his students, and not only was he working to build the school, the students were working to build the school. So the students would help with laying bricks and doing things like that, and they would attend chapel where he would preach at chapel because he did attend seminary for a very brief period of time. He does attend seminary, so he's preaching at the chapel services. He's helping them to learn things that are real skill based. You mentioned earlier the career technical education type of stuff. And when I look at the Tuskegee University website, even today, that's the focus of their education. You got agriculture and engineering and science and things like that. It's very skill based education, science based education. That's what they're still focusing on there. But he is teaching them all sorts of things. And, it goes from 30 students to 400 students to a very large number of students in a just literally just in a few years. And what he's teaching these students is um, um, dignity and and I can't say the word glorify common labor. He's teaching them to that work, that labor is what is connected to dignity. You want to have dignity in your life, you want to have all that, you need to work. You need to push yourself into some task and complete that task. So that's really what he's doing. He's teaching these guys not just reading, writing, arithmetic, but reading, writing, arithmetic, and skills.
And Tuskegee really just expands. It just grows exponentially. People are just amazed. Once again, we have to be reminded that here is someone born into slavery who is now in Alabama, who is starting a school for African Americans in the deep, deep South. And it is not long before people start saying, wow, there's something about this Booker T. Washington character, what he is doing, what he has been able to do. And so he is then given the opportunity of a lifetime, where he is asked to go and to speak in 1895 in Atlanta, Georgia, the Atlanta Exposition, Cotton States and International Exposition. And it is there where he basically says that for the first time in history, that you have a black man who is able to stand on the same platform as a white man and in equal terms be able to give a speech to white Southern men and women. What an important, historic, monumental moment. And that speech is what separates him, especially from W.E.B. Du Bois, but also is where his career begins to kind of experience a few bumps in the way, basically because of what it is that he shares in that speech. And many people are, I've asked my students to read parts of that speech, excerpts of that speech in class. And, one of the things that it is he has this, this one sentence, if you will, or the climax of the speech, which is what people still remember Booker T. Washington saying. And that kind of sets him on track for people saying, okay, maybe I'm for it or maybe I'm against it, in the way that he spoke concerning the rights and the liberties of Black individuals.
Yeah, because he's different than your Martin Luther Kings. Your Martin Luther Kings and your W.E.B. Du Bois are about breaking down Jim Crow. They're about breaking down segregation. Booker T. Washington, that's not his focus, at least publicly. Publicly, his focus is more that it's better for blacks to remain separate from whites. That's effectively what he was saying. That they could get along with whites, they could live side by side with whites, and as long as they were given equal opportunity, there was no reason for desegregation in his mind, which is very different, from what we think about when we think about the civil rights movement and we think about Central High School in Arkansas and all that stuff is, all that was about desegregation, putting everybody together. And he was at least publicly against that.
Plessy versus Ferguson, which the speech comes just 1 year before Plessy versus Ferguson, which
Mm-hmm.
is the separate but equal, and allows for there to be this desegregation process. But Washington's pledge, Washington's commitment was that he and other African Americans were going to pursue economic opportunities in their own way. But basically, what he is doing is saying, we're going to do it in our own way, but we're going to keep that old attitude of adjustment and submission. And this is where Du Bois really gets ticked off at him, because, they're basically saying, wait a second, we've worked hard to get to this point, and we're not going to go back to the old way of not having rights and not having liberty, and that we, need to be united, that we need to be together. And, in that speech, he basically thanks both races for the opportunity to stand up and to give the speech and welcoming back to be able to say things. But Ray, one of the things that he says in that speech is he uses a metaphor about the hand. And in that speech, he says, in all things that are purely social, we can be as separate as the fingers, yet one as the hand in all things essential to mutual progress. And so people took that as saying, okay, we're separate as the fingers. You've got whites that have certain things that they can do, and then blacks have certain things that they can do. We're still together as Americans, but really we're not equal. And some people did not think that that was right. They wanted, we demand justice, we demand it now, we demand equality, it needs to happen now. And Du Bois and his followers did not really find that speech to be what the American dream was for African Americans.
Yeah, and I said several times, and you've hinted at it as well, that this was sort of his public position. It was later on, it was discovered that while he was saying those things publicly, privately, he was actually funding lawsuits against segregation. He was funding lawsuits against Jim Crow. He was helping people out in that way. He also wrote letters um, defending people. So he, on one hand, yes, he was controversial because he took a different position. Instead of desegregation, it was more, well, we'll go over here and we'll sort of do our own thing. Um, but at the same time, he is sort of under the radar, um, using his money to try to work for desegregation in a way. I mean, low key, but he's doing it.
And if you go and look at the psychology or physiology of this, one of the things about Booker T is that Booker T, we know that his mother was an enslaved woman, and she was one of six enslaved people that was enslaved by a tobacco farmer, James Burrow. But Booker T says in his autobiography that his father was simply a white man who lived on one of the nearby plantations. So, one of the struggles for Booker T, I feel, going back to that metaphor of the hand, is that Booker T was biracial.
Yeah.
He had and a tobacco farmer who was white, and his mother, and he wanted, as you mentioned earlier, he wanted nothing to do with his father. He really had nothing to, he didn't want to acknowledge his son, or excuse me, he didn't want to acknowledge his father, and you know that I think shows some of the struggle that he has because in his blood, if you will, is the blood of enslaved punishment, as a mother, a child he was actually a slave, he was
Mm-hmm.
enslaved.
Mm-hmm.
So I see the struggle that he is going through, and maybe because of that is why he gets up there and says, I want us to work together. I want us to be together, and I'm trying to get us there, but I want to get us there a little bit slower. I want us to take our time
Right.
in getting there, where W.B. Du Bois is going to come in and say, slower. Heck, we've been enslaved for years. We don't have time for this. Let's just all kumbaya and hope it all works out. It's time for us to really demonstrate that we deserve, equality. So, I wonder if those are some of his inner struggles that he's having, as he's trying to find the best path forward to ultimately, as you mentioned, achieve desegregation.
Yeah, and I think sometimes we have to remember there wasn't really a clear roadmap for him. He was sort of out on his own. Nobody had. I mean, there have been important figures in the civil rights movement for African Americans, from before the emancipation of slavery all the way up to his day. But he was at a time and coming into a time when he was in a lot of ways sort of a revolutionary figure. and there wasn't a roadmap. He couldn't look back on people like Martin Luther King and W.E.B. Du Bois and others like that. So he had nobody to look back on. So he was sort of trying to, sort of find the best way that he could to get where, he thought people needed to be.
Right. And so I go back to this last thing I'll share about him is that, and I'll take another quote from him in his book. And by the way, I know it might be hard going back reading these books from so long ago, but
Right.
excerpts from his book are just so powerful to me. That he writes in his autobiography in the opening paragraph, he says, I suspect I must have been born somewhere and at some time. And so to me, you have an individual who had no formal birth certificate, who relied on the memories of others to try to figure out where he was born, how he was born, who he was born to. And yet here he is, who truly makes a difference in American history to the point that Theodore Roosevelt says, I want you to come and sit with me and have dinner at the grandest house of them all in America, at the White House, who even his critic, the one who didn't really agree with everything that was being done, still went and said, he is notable because of what he really tried to do, of how he really tried to make a difference. And I look at that in today's history, and I think that we don't give enough credit to those things that people do and the way that they do them. And I have so much respect for him stepping up in the arena, full of courage, full of strength, bravery, and willing to do it all, not for him, but for those who are like him.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. The end of his life, in the early 20th century, we have the election of 1912, which we see the election of Democrat Woodrow Wilson, who doesn't have a very, let's say, good approach to racial relations, and so Washington sort of falls out of favor, because people are wanting the view of W.E.B. Du Bois to sort of, be the predominant view. But he does stay there at the Tuskegee Institute until he dies of heart failure in 1915. So, he was 59 years old when he died there. I believe that was in 1915, the year before my grandmother was born. So, great life, someone who did a lot of great things, worked hard to get where he was and to do what he did. And like I said, the Tuskegee University is still there today as part of his legacy.
And not only is it still there today, but go back to what you were talking about at the beginning. He starts the school from ground up.
Yeah,
It numbered 30 students. He was the lone faculty member,
yeah,
and he did it on a small little loan from a Methodist church. And if you understand it, when he passes away, 1,500 students a year, and it's on a campus that has over 100 buildings and 3,500 acres. And so I do think that is a testament to who he is and to what he does.
yeah, absolutely. Well, Chris, this has been a great episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I really enjoyed researching this topic a little deeper than what I normally have in the past. I hope our listeners have enjoyed this episode. Hey, you're listening to us now. Give us a like, give us a share, whether you're listening to us on Spotify, Anchor, YouTube, like, share, comment. We encourage you to do all of those things just so we can get more listeners, so people can learn more about history you didn't know but should. Until next time, I'm Ray.
I'm Chris.
I'll talk to you later.